Good morning, students. This is Mr. Montes, and we have your second lesson for the week. This one's going to be pretty short. First of all, I would like to apologize if you hear Baby Shark playing in the background. That is so my kid does not cry. So you're welcome to sing along with that if you would like. So today's lesson is called Solving Quadratics Continued. Let's review what we did last lesson. Last lesson, we talked about this thing called the zero factor property. Now, the zero factor property is stated here, which says, I'm going to grab my mouse real quick. Zero factor property, A times B equals 0, means that either A equals 0 or B equals 0. This is a unique situation. Whenever I have two numbers, or you could even do this for more than two numbers, but in this case, we'll just stick to the most simple example. When you have two numbers multiplied together and the result is 0, it doesn't matter what those two numbers are. One of them or both has to be 0. So what we did with that was we applied that zero factor property to solving polynomials or quadratics, more specifically. For example, x squared plus 12x plus 11 equals 0 is a quadratic, and we would like to know what values of x make it true. So what values of x can I plug into that quadratic such that the result will be 0, as the equation states. So what we do is we factor it. And in this case, this quadratic is factorable. I use the x method, as you can see right here. What times what gives me 11, which is C, but adds up to B, which is 12. And those numbers are 11 and 1. 11 times 1 is 11, but 11 plus 1 is 12. So those are my two factors, which you see right here highlighted, x plus 11 and x plus 1. And then we take those two factors because they're multiplied together and the result is 0. Either x plus 11 is equal to 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. So what we're going to do with those is now we have a really simple equation to solve. Subtract 11 from both sides, x equals negative 11, and we subtract 1 from both sides, x equals negative 1. So our two solutions for this quadratic that make the equation true are going to be x equals negative 11 and x equals negative 1, which you may or may not have learned to write it like this, with what we call curly brackets, negative 11 and negative 1. Okay, so here's the question, is what if the quadratic is not equal to 0? I mean, the property that we're using is called the zero factor property. So what if I end up with something like this? What if I end up with x squared minus 11x minus 2 equals negative 20? Okay, is there such thing as a negative 20 factor property? If I have a number A times a number B, and that equals negative 20, does that mean one or the other is equal to 0? Actually, we can conclude that neither A nor B can be 0, because if they were, then the result would be 0. So in this case, we kind of have to manipulate the quadratic a little bit. And here's the thing. We are working with an equation. And as long as I do the same thing to both sides of the equation, with the exception of a handful of things that we're not going to get into right now because that's not what we're doing, as long as I do the same thing to both sides, I can come up with an equivalent equation that I can then solve that will have the same solutions as this one. So I'm going to be clever about this. And remember, it's called the zero factor property because the two things that are multiplied together give me 0. So I'm going to be clever and I'm going to do this. I'm going to add 20 to each side. Now I don't add it just to any piece. Notice that I'm lining it up so that with this like term. So I'm going to underline that, scroll down a little bit, and I'm going to come up with x squared minus 11x, 20 minus 2, or negative 2 plus 20 is going to be plus 18. And now this is equal to 0. So what I've done here is I've taken my original equation and I've created an equivalent equation. 3 lines like that means equivalent, means that they were, in this case, are going to have the same solutions. I created a new equation and the result is 0 for this equation. So what I can do now is I can try to factor. Now I can use my x game. Remember, we got A, B, C, right? We got A. Let me write this here. A, which is 1. We got B, which is negative 11. and we got C, which is 18. So what times what gives me 18, but when I add it together, it gives me negative 11. Now there is something to point out. The only reason I can just steal 18 from here is because this is 1. There will be quadratics later on that you'll deal with, probably maybe in geometry or algebra 3-4, where this is not 1 right here. And you will have to take this number and multiply it to this number to get this right here. And actually the factoring takes a little bit more time. It's a little bit longer, but we're not going to deal with that. Let's just stick to simple stuff, right? So what two numbers multiply to give me 18 but add up to negative 11? Well, let's check. I'm going to start writing some down. I'm trying to make sure my face doesn't cover up the work. So let's try, let's go with 6 times 3. 6 times 3 is 18. However, 6 plus 3 is 9. Doesn't work. Okay. How about 9 times 2? That's 18. Okay. But 9 plus 2 is positive 11. So we're real close. I really just want this to be negative 11. So you know what? I'm going to put this in a box and we're going to think about it a little bit. Is there another way that I can get positive 18 with 9 and 2? Well, obviously not 9 and 2, right? But there is. And you have to remember that a negative times a negative is equal to a positive 18. But when I add a negative plus a negative, I end up with negative 11. So my two numbers that I'm looking for are negative 9 and negative 2. Negative 9 and negative 2, right? Sometimes when you start tossing out negatives in there, things get a little bit more complicated. But as long as you remember that a negative times a negative is a positive, in this situation, like, you should be able to come up with those two numbers. All right, so let's factor. We know at the very least it'll be x and x, and these two numbers that we have here are going to be replaced here. Minus 9 minus 2, and this is still equal to 0. We got to remember that piece. We're not dealing with just an expression, we're dealing with an equation. So now we're going to take this guy, x minus 9 equals 0, and we're taking this guy, or x minus 2 equals 0. You know, I left off the parentheses. It is totally okay to do that. You don't have to keep the parentheses here. And now I just do a little bit of solving, and you know what? I regret this already. This should be black. That's the nice thing. That's the nice thing about having a Microsoft Surface, is that it's easy to change things. Now all I have to do is add 9 to both sides to solve for x on this one. X equals 9. Or I need to add 2 to both sides to solve for x here. So x equals, going too fast, x equals positive 2. So my two solutions are x equals 9 and x equals positive 2 for this equation equation up here. Now you can always test them. Let's just do one of them. I'll do x equals 2. The numbers are a little bit smaller. Let me write down the quadratic. It's x squared minus 11x, what was it, minus 2 equals negative 20. That's where we're starting. I'm going to test this guy right here. So I'm going to plug in 2. Is 2 squared minus 11 times 2 minus 2, is that in fact equal to negative 20? Let's highlight some things. This is what I'm testing. Whoops. I did not click on the highlighter. Plug it in there and there. Everywhere I see an x. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. Minus 11 times 2 is 22. Minus 2, is that equal to negative 20? 4 minus 22 is negative 18. Minus 2, is that equal to negative 20? Negative 18, and you subtract 2 more, you should end up with negative 20 equals negative 20. And look at that. We just solved a quadratic equation we weren't equal to 0. We just have to be a little bit clever about how we do it. Now, this is the second assignment for this week. You have, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 more problems. The last one is always a little bit tricky, but again, if you have issues, feel free to contact your teacher. Don't forget that you need to turn in your assignments. You got till the end of the year, which I think is June 17th. Don't quote me on that. Yeah, let's get this stuff done, and it looks like the kid is up. So anyways, you guys have a good week, and we'll talk to you next week. See ya.